Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Especially as August is meant to be the month, we have a break from meetings. So thank you all for coming. And I would just mention Merton.TV, welcome their presence. If anybody is concerned, make sure you're within the camera view. But members are used to being filmed, and it helps the transparency of our processes. I want to make a couple of points about this. From time to time, the administration will make decisions that are unpopular. The fact we don't like them is not a reason in itself for subjecting them to call-in. Call-in is really applied to where you feel one of the principles of the council's decision-making processes has been not observed. And I'll run them through them briefly. Those principles are that the decision be demonstrate proportionality. In other words, the action proposed should be proportionate to the outcome you seek. That due consultation, taking advice from officers has been followed. That the decision shows respect for human rights and equalities. There is a presumption in favour of openness, in other words, in taking decisions in public meetings. That the aims are clear, as are the desired outcomes, and that due consideration has been given to alternatives to the decision proposed. So those are the elements that those who brought the call-in will need to demonstrate have been not respected. Second point I want to make is that this one has done the rounds. It's been to Cabinet twice. It's been subject to 2 rounds of pre-decision scrutiny in January and July. Really, I think we now understand what happens if you come back and present the same case and expect the decision to change. So I'm really looking for new evidence this evening, not points that have been put forward in previous meetings, to give a reason for why this should be referred back. Okay. We'll follow quite a set order. We're going to take there are 2 call-ins. The Lib Dem call-in was received first. We're going to take that one first. Briefly, I'll invite the signatories to the call-in to present their case. Commission members then will have a chance to ask questions of them. And if there are witnesses then, they will speak at that stage. And Cabinet members and officers will respond. Then the discussion is with the members of the Commission, rather like a planning committee meeting actually. And they must reach a conclusion as to whether the decision should be referred back to Cabinet for reconsideration or not. So I think we can start. Councillor Fenner. Oh, all right. Sorry, so we do. It's still a normal meeting in that regard. Apologies from Councillor Henry. Welcome to Councillor David Chung, substituting for her. And apologies also from our court. Yes. And any declarations of pecuniary interest? There are none. So, Councillor Fairclough, if you'd like to come forward. I think you've been warned we're going to be running quite tightly to the agreed timing, so you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. As we've already mentioned, this call-in is not simply a rerun of the debates. We've already had a full council and the 2 rounds of scrutiny. We're raising 2 specific points that go to the principles of decision-making. The first is about a potential flaw in the way the council ran its equality assessment process, and the second is about the fundamental lack of evidence to support one of the main claims of the policy. Looking first at the equality assessment process, the process is actually set out on the council's quality assessment flowchart, which requires officers to identify protected groups that might be negatively impacted by any policy change, and then to review ways to remove or minimise the negative impact whilst consulting with appropriate stakeholders about this. And they used that to draw up an improvement action plan, and this didn't happen. So despite the fact that the potential negative impacts were identified for some disabled people, pregnant women, and those of certain socio-economic status, the Council hasn't actively engaged with people from those groups about how to remove or minimise those negative impacts. We know that officers prepared 3 revisions of this part of the equality assessment, and we know from answers given at the June scrutiny that no equality groups were directly consulted with about this part of the assessment at any point. The officer's response to calling on page 169 of your pack argues that the general public consultation in March meets the requirement in the flowchart because that linked to the first version of the equality assessment from January. Now, Appendix C5 sets out the generic consultation documents that were sent to everyone, not just equality groups, on the Council's email list. But the flowchart itself separates out general consultation from specific consultation on the action plan. Furthermore, much was changed and added to the two further revisions of the equality assessment, and given such big changes to that document and a lack of responses from relevant groups, it seems clear that further and direct consultation on these points was needed before the equality assessment was presented to Cabinet. The public sector equality duty is an ongoing responsibility to review, revise and consult, and not a tick box exercise. So when considering groups protected by our equality laws, the relevant principle is no decision about us without us. Can we honestly say that that threshold was met here? Now, my second point turns to whether any evidence was presented to Cabinet that increasing the cost of residence parking permits will, in the words of the report, deliver reduced car ownership and thereby improve air quality. That's the mechanism. Without evidence that these charges will encourage people to give up their cars, and no detail on how many cars will be given up or by when, we're unable to assess the effectiveness of the policy. Now, this is fundamental. It strikes at the heart of the proportionality of the measures, the clarity of the aims and the objectives, and it distracts from the consideration of alternative options. The January scrutiny panel requested the administration present further evidence to support the proposals. To meet that requirement, various academic papers and reports were referred to. You can see both from our short paper at Appendix D4, page 237, and indeed the officer's summary itself, these papers do not support the contention that increasing parking charges will result in car ownership. They're about the impact of higher charges for town centre and commuter parking on driving to particular areas. So I'd like to ask the Cabinet members to set out exactly how the evidence they presented indicates that car ownership will go down, and how they've assessed that the charges they propose to assure their effectiveness. Broadly, how many cars they think will be given up, and what impact they think this will have on air quality. Now, without this, I'm afraid it simply looks like revenue raising, a policy designed to fail in its stated purpose of improving air quality. And Commission, if you're not satisfied by their answers, we would ask you to return it to the decision maker. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. It's now for members of the Commission if they have questions for Councillor Becker.
Thank you, that's clear. So the 2 points are quoting evidence. With regards to evidence, I fully get what you're saying, that the need for evidence underpins the requirement for clear aims, which is one of the statement principles. My question is with regards to the forecasting. Having sat through this sort of meeting last time, and one of the topics that was discussed was that we know that one of the answers was effectively we know it will decline, but we don't know exactly by how much, because we know that behaviour will tend this way, but we can't say exactly. What are you looking for? Are you looking for a sort of metric example based on previous studies, previous pilots? Are you looking for a sort of exact forecast to the nearest car, or are you just looking for evidence to say that when costs go up, inelasticity leads to a reduction, or elasticity, I should say, leads to a reduction? What are you looking for?
Thank you. I think what's clear is that actually no evidence has been presented that increasing residence permits will result in people giving up their cars. That's the evidence, that's the mechanism that's set out in this proposal. It's, people will give up their cars and people will drive less. There's no evidence been presented at all. And on top of that, the point that you highlight, and obviously I sat through the scrutiny panel with you on that, is that it's interesting to me that there's been no kind of attempt to sort of bullshit button. There's been no attempt set out to say how we want air quality to improve. What's the measure of success? I think when we were talking about the diesel levy, I think the cabinet member at the time said if even one fewer car is taken off the road, that's enough. Well, frankly, that's not enough. And without any attempt to measure or to set a framework to measure success, that's where we are. Something must be done. This is something. Is that good enough for us?
Other questions?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Fairclough. I have one question. I think in one of your written submissions in the run-up to the call-in, I noticed there was a reference to scrappage deals that you were proposing. And are you able to give us some more information about those scrappage deals? Presumably you're suggesting they would be funded and arranged by the local authority, by us as a borough, or what did you have in mind for that exactly, in terms of considering alternatives?
I think tonight is supposed to be about checking whether the administration has followed its, the principles of decision making, and I'm not sure whether a scrappage scheme that we might propose is part of that. I think what is clear, you also were at the full council meeting in February where we put forward some of our ideas, and the administration, reverted back to its own plans, which is essentially this. So yes, what we look for is to see the cabinet member reconsidering, maybe waiting for its own diesel levy review, maybe waiting for its own emissions-based charging review, learning from that, and then putting something else forward. And at the same time, there's plenty of other examples from around London that we might look at. The Mayor has a diesel scrappage scheme, which Merton does promote, not a diesel scrappage, a scrappage scheme for businesses, which Merton does promote a little bit. There are also low-emission bus schemes in Putney, which I know your group is very fond of. There are positive measures that can be taken, but tonight isn't really about my group's proposals. Tonight is about whether the cabinet member and the cabinet have approached this decision in the right way.
Going back to Owen's point and the evidence, I've just been looking for it. This Canadian study is referred to in parking in Amsterdam. Doesn't it, in fact, isn't the evidence exactly the opposite of what the council is saying? From the Canadian study of parking in Amsterdam, people are willing to pay £40,000 extra for a house with parking. Doesn't that show that this is bound to fail, this scheme? No, I'm asking him, not you. You're asking him.
You can write a report. Certainly this is one that officers can...
Well,
I'd like to come back on that, if I may. I think what is clear is that the logic of the council proposal is if the fees, that the costs that they're putting forward don't work, the logic is that they will have to increase. And that was a question I asked in the June scrutiny meeting, and that was the answer I received from officers. We don't quite know whether these measures will work, and they're about 2% on the cost of owning a car. And what we see from the Canadian report is that the people in Amsterdam were willing to pay €40,000 extra, £40,000 thereabouts extra for a parking space. So that's a very high threshold. So this is the threshold that we're coming to for people to give up their cars. So are we really saying that a 2% increase is going to force people to give up their cars? That's the mechanism by which this scheme improves air quality, when people give up their cars. So I think the logic of this scheme has got to be that prices will increase in the future to make it work. And if they don't increase them to make it work, it's not something I want, definitely not something I want organised by postcode, then actually that's set up for a failure. That's set up not to work, that's set up to raise revenue and not to improve air quality.
Thank you, Councillor Fairclough. In your opening remarks, you referred to whether the Council had given due regard to alternative proposals. I know in your report and submissions you refer to ultra-low emission zones. Is that something that you think that the Council should be giving more regard to? You think that's a good policy?
I think, yes, I think there was lots of ideas in the consultation responses in those groups that put forward consultation responses, like the Liberal Democrat group, but unfortunately not like the Conservative group. There are lots of alternatives that could be looked at. I actually think, in defence of the Council, not that that's what I'm here for, that a low emission zone is in fact being looked at, although the details on that are a little bit sketchy, from my point of view anyway as an opposition councillor. But I think both our groups support low emission zones, so yes.
Hi. I noticed, obviously, because when we were at the panel, this came up about the equalities and who had been directly consulted, and I noticed in the officer's response that Wimbledon Guild, Age UK Merton, the Polish Family Organisation, Bain Voice, Carers Support UK, Merton, the Ethnic Minority Centre, Mitcham Morden Guild, Merton Seal, and Merton Seniors Forum had all been directly consulted. You're saying they haven't. I mean, you're saying the officer's response is incorrect when they say that.
I'm saying that your interpretation is, I don't agree with it.
Okay, fair enough. And are there other groups you would have liked to have seen on that list?
So I think it's very important to understand what the officer's response says and what the council's process requires. So the council's process requires at stage 6 that consultation, new consultation is considered if data doesn't exist, and then they review whether negative impacts on any particular groups occur. They then draw up attempts to mitigate that. They then consult with relevant stakeholders about that mitigation. Does that mitigation work for you? Does it have the effect that we want? We think it affects your group in this way. Does it actually improve things? We talk a lot about blue badges in the equality assessment. Have they spoken to any groups that represent people with blue badges to work out if this is mitigation? Does it work? And to me, this, and to our group, this is actually a two-stage thing. It's not general consultation covers it all. It's a constant process. It is general consultation, you get your base data, you then look at the impacts, you then see who's affected, and you say, we think this will mitigate. Do you agree this will mitigate? Is there anything else we can do? That's what we're missing. What you see in the officer's report is that there's the March consultation, which was the general consultation to everybody. There's some general consultation materials at C5 in your appendix. It's a brief email with a link. That link contained hundreds of pages of documents, including the very first version of the Equality Impact Assessment, the January Equality Impact Assessment. That is a very different document to the third Equality Impact Assessment, especially in relation to mitigation of potential discrimination. So even if you agree, even if you think that the March consultation, the general consultation, was enough, the third Equality Impact Assessment is a very different document, and no one ever went back to any groups to say, this different document, the one you haven't seen, is this enough? And yet Cabinet obviously placed great weight on the amendments that were made to the Equality Impact Assessment. They thought that was important, but they didn't think it was important enough to go back to any groups to consult under 8 of the flowchart.
But had they not amended them because of the response they had from the consultation and through our panels and through the things we discussed at panel? Had they not done that work and then revised the assessment because of the consultation results they received?
They may very well have done that, but one thing they do say is that none of the groups that they highlight responded. So actually they had no specific response on the Equality Impact Assessment. They revised the Equality Impact Assessment despite the fact that no one responded to it. So I think it's unlikely that they revised the Equality Impact Assessment in response to consultation responses from those groups. So, and also the public sector equality duty is a constant is a requirement of constant review. It would have seemed appropriate to me, when you have almost completely rewritten the section on mitigation, to go back to some groups and say, have we got this right? That's not an unreasonable hurdle. Did we get it right? And if the answer is, actually, we don't care enough to respond, fair enough. But that didn't happen. We know that didn't happen because in the June scrutiny meeting that you were at, when I asked that question, we were told by the officer, no groups have been consulted with directly. There's just the generic March consultation that went to everybody.
Do we have other questions?
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah, sure. I'm looking for questions rather than comments this way.
Okay,
Other questions? And then I'll
Just one, referring to your point about the constant process, and you said you and your group see it as a constant process where it's a sort of feedback. Is that a fair representation of what you're saying?
I think the law on the public sector equality duty requires that, yes.
With regards to that, at which point in the feedback loop do you implement and continue to feedback? Because obviously the consultation should occur after the parking charges have been implemented as well, to continue to mitigate, all right? Given that no one's fed back at this point, an appropriate time to listen further would be after the initial implementation.
So the council process, as set out in this document, is to consult. This is section 6, consult. After consultation, it is to assess whether any groups could be negatively impacted. Now what we know is the March consultation, they'd already done that because the January quality assessment had already attempted to do that pre-consultation. They may have got data from internally, but pre the general consultation. Once you determine that some groups are negatively impacted, we're instructed that you have to draw up a list of areas of concern to review any ways to remove or mitigate that. That's the action plan, which is in part 3, I think, of the equality assessment. And at that point, consult appropriate stakeholders as part of the review. Now, we know that this document was reviewed at least twice. It was reviewed, presumably the first time, the second equality impact assessment and the third assessment. At either of those 2 reviews that produced the second equality impact assessment or the third equality impact assessment, no groups, no stakeholders were consulted with. And what we're saying is this seems to us a failure to follow this process, and therefore that's how it breaches the principle of decision making.
Just following on from that, the idea of appropriate stakeholders in light of 0 responses to impacted people, right? Who do you think? Do you think they share the common definition that all impacted people are appropriate stakeholders?
I think, actually, I draw the opposite conclusion. I think if you send out a general consultation with hundreds of pages of documents, of which an equality impact assessment is somewhere at the bottom, and no one from any of your groups that you yourself identify as impacted responds, you then review and revise that a further twice more on the basis of no evidence from groups that represent the three groups of people you think are negatively affected. I think actually the public sector equality duty requires you to specifically go to groups, maybe even to go back to the groups that haven't responded to the general consultation and the hundreds of pages of reports, just with those points, and say, we just want to check. We think that blue badges will mitigate the impact of people with disabilities. What do you think? What do your members think? That's reasonable. And as I say, I think actually the lack of response to the general consultation to me is the flag that when you're revising it, you should go back specifically and directly.
That's clear, thank you.
If there are no further questions, we don't have other witnesses to agree. So thank you, Councillor Kirkwood. I'm going to invite cabinet officers to respond now. Councillor Bryant.
Chair, if I could ask Chris Lee to start off by talking specifically on the EIA process.
So, thank you for the points made. Just dealing with the 2 points in turn, starting with the equality impact assessment. The duty placed on local authorities under the public sector equality duty is to pay due regard to the impact on...
Can you speak up, please?
Certainly. To pay due regard to the impact that policy changes might have on those with protected characteristics, and having consulted with the Equalities Officer on a number of occasions with regard to this particular policy, I can assure members that that is what the Council has done. Everett Willis, who's the Council's Equalities Officer with a lot of experience, has been closely involved with Ben Stevens in the production of the equalities analysis, the impact assessment and the improvement plan, and she is entirely satisfied that we've complied with that duty. We wrote extensively to the groups identified in the paper. We had a 10-week consultation period. We received no responses from those equalities groups. We did identify some equalities impact, which is dealt with in the paper and addressed in the improvement plan. I understand some of those equalities groups were invited this evening, but I don't believe they're attending. I think the policy proposal that we have here is proportionate in terms of the impact and the benefit, the positive benefit that it delivers to all groups. We've identified the potential negative impact. I know that the impact on the elderly was one that was particularly focused on at previous scrutiny meetings and at Cabinet, and we've identified that the elderly per se aren't adversely affected, but there may be a subset of elderly people who have a disability, and we've sought to address that, and particularly with regard to the blue badge scheme, those residents would receive a free resident permit and already benefit from that, and there is provision for a carer's permit. So we believe that in terms of equalities, and I was at pains to point this out to the Cabinet, their need to ensure that they take due regard to the impact on equality groups, that we've complied with the guidance and the statutory requirement to the letter. We will, of course, as the paper says, keep this under review, and you're right that this is a live process, and we will want to monitor the impact on those equalities groups in order to continue to assess whether there is any further negative impact in order to identify whether further mitigation is required. In terms of the evidence that this will have an impact, members are quite right that there are no, we've done lots of research and talked to colleagues in other boroughs, and there are no current examples of this policy approach. And I suppose that's a reflection of the fact that we are at the forefront with other authorities in trying to discharge our duty around improving air quality and tackling climate change. And local authorities are looking for every policy lever that they have in order to make that change. And we're limited in those policy levers, and so we're seeking to use them as well as we can with the maximum effect, but with the intention of continuing to monitor it over time to see what the impact is. And some policies, some new initiatives have to begin without direct empirical evidence that this will work, but with the intention of experimenting to see what the benefit is in the public's interest. And that's the intention here, to carry out that, but to continue to monitor it. And it's also worth reminding ourselves that this is, again, proportionate and at the margins in terms of an economic driver. Members have mentioned that in terms of the cost of purchasing a car, it's a fairly small element, and it could be argued that it should be higher in order to nudge. But that's not the intention at this point. The proposal is proportionate and we believe reasonable, as one of a series of measures to nudge behaviour alongside, we would hope, motorists' perception about air quality in London and their desire to do the right thing for the environment and for the city. Our growing understanding of public health matters and the need to be more active in the way that we live our lives, and people's behaviour alongside those economic nudges will change over time. It may not be instant, almost certainly won't be instant, but over time it should have the desired effect. And we believe that others will seek to adopt the same sort of policy. Just finally, whilst there isn't direct evidence in the application of this to resident permits, we do see the application of pricing in car parking and in entering congestion zones, and there's no reason to believe why the same economic principles won't apply in this area as in any other area. There are other factors in play, the capital cost of a car and the decision point in terms of whether to replace that car or to go for a lower emission vehicle, an electric car for example, and we believe that taking all those factors into account, this should nudge the right behaviour and have a beneficial effect on car ownership and then ultimately on air quality and public health.
add a couple of points. So I think what Chris said about the purpose of the policy is really important, and we have slightly lost sight of that because the debate has become very focused on air quality. But in the very first Cabinet papers that considered this last year and all the way through, we have been clear that the purpose is not just about better air quality, but it's also about less sedentary behaviour, more active lifestyles, and about creating healthier places. And that takes me to Councillor Fairclough's comment about measurement, and I think we need to be very clear about the difference between measurement and outputs, because whilst the outputs we seek are better air quality and a healthier borough, there are so many factors that impact on those things. It's very difficult to use that matrix to measure the success or failure of this particular policy, which is why the measures that are set out on page 172 of the pack, and which I believe form part of the consultation, seek to measure it in terms of the number of permits, which is a measurable factor far more so than air quality, and very similar to the measurement that we're currently using to assess the diesel levy with the 2-year review. And the final point I just wanted to make, there's been a lot of comment on any number of other policies that the Cabinet should be seeking to implement. And we've always been clear that this is not an either-or scenario, these are complementary policies. So if we accept that around 60% of the NO2 emissions generated in the borough come from road transport, there are two ways we can deal with that. We can seek to reduce the number of vehicles that are using our roads, and if we can't reduce them, we can seek to clean up those vehicles. So the diesel levy was very much aimed at that latter one, to try and get cleaner vehicles on our roads. This policy is about trying to reduce the number of vehicles using our roads. And there are a number of other things that are being looked at through the Air Quality Action Plan, including a clean air zone, which we're starting to look at in Wimbledon Town Centre. So I think we need to be clear that this is one policy of a suite of policies. This formed part of the Air Quality Action Plan. It was specifically cited within that we should undertake a review of parking with a view to improving air quality. And this is just one measure of a number that we are looking at to improve air quality across the borough.
No further.
Chair, are we able to respond with a question to the Cabinet member now?
Well, not allowed, yes, to ask questions of Cabinet members. So I'll take Councillor Pritchard, then I'll come to you.
I think the issue of evidence was covered quite well. You know, it's difficult to believe that car use is perfectly inelastic. It's easy to accept that innovation is important. It's easy to accept that, given the air quality crisis and the environmental crisis, that these sort of measures are proportional. However, I don't think you, and I may be wrong, but I don't think you spoke to specifically Councillor Fairclough's allegation that you hadn't followed the process as laid out in your own plan, that you didn't follow it in the manner that you should have. And if that is the case, does that undermine the principle of consultation and indeed consultation and human rights and equality that were touched on when Councillor Southgate introduced? So can you just speak specifically to that, please?
So my guide is from Everett Willis, who's been closely involved in this. This is the Council's Equalities Officer, who's satisfied with the process we've undertaken. Our process goes above and beyond, the Council's process goes above and beyond the statutory duty. There isn't a government laid down set of processes that you need to adopt. We have adopted a Council process, and the guidance is set out in that flowchart. Since we didn't receive responses from these equalities groups, we took the responses from residents and amended the impact assessment. And since we didn't receive responses from the equality group, we didn't go back to them specifically, because we understood the impact that was identified, and it wasn't a significant impact, but we did identify that impact, and we've set out to do it is open for, we've been in public debate about.
Sorry, Mr. Lee, could you put your...
Sorry, it's gone off automatically. There's been a public debate about this for some time now, and we've had no further representation from those equalities groups that the improvement plan is flawed, or we haven't identified some matters which they believe should be brought to the fore in order to illuminate the impacts that we might be having on those groups. So we believe, as it stands, the impact assessment and the improvement plan are correct and accurate.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question for the Cabinet member, Councillor Byers, about the extent of the actual consultation that either took place or did not take place with these very important groups such as Merton Seniors, Wimbledon Guild, Age UK Merton. These are really important groups in our community, and I think, as you said, Chair, at the beginning, this is all about due consultation. It's very easy for somebody to send an email to one of these organisations and not get a response. That's a norm. You actually have to ring them up. We know who those people are. We know who runs those organisations. They have meetings here every month. Their offices are very short walk away. It's very easy to ring those organisations up, surely, and say, have you got the email? Can we explain what this consultation is all about, the big hike in parking charges in Wimbledon? Can we tell you a bit about it, and do you have any concerns? That would really be due consultation. You can't say you consulted duly just by sending an email to somebody and saying, sorry, they didn't respond and therefore we've taken them into full consideration. It just doesn't wash that. So what's the Cabinet member's response to that?
I mean, I think the directors answered the point about what consultation did take place with those groups and the fact that those groups did not engage in that process. I don't really have anything further to add, Chair.
Chris, with respect, you've just argued by assertion. You have a process. You have a process whereby you identify, issues are identified, mitigation is then considered, and then your process says you go back to those people and ask them, will what we're suggesting work? And your argument at the last bit is, we think it'll work, but the whole point about the process is you go back. And to say they didn't respond last time, therefore we'll assume they won't respond this time, isn't a good enough answer. You have a process, and you're not using it. You must see that, surely.
I think we're straying into the area we're going to get to next discussion rather than...
Oh, I thought it was a question. Oh, okay.
You agree?
Yes, do you agree?
I think the response on the equalities impact assessment was proportionate. And I think that the skill and professionalism of the officer involved, along with Everett Willis, the equalities officer, to identify the issues raised by residents and the minimal impact on those groups. We're talking here about a small proportionate increase in the cost of owning a car compared to the total cost of the car. And I think it's about getting the proportion right in terms of how we apply and meet our public sector equalities duty.
Well, that moves me to my second point. As you said, it's a small increase in the cost of a car, and yet you think it will affect ownership, when the only evidence you've given us shows us that people are willing to pay a vast amount for parking spaces. So, isn't it total absence of evidence on the second part, the second issue? Isn't that absolutely fundamental? The only evidence you've given us shows us people pay a vast amount for parking spaces.
Well, we know that from Amsterdam, and Amsterdam is a quite unique place. It is that Amsterdam has taken a very robust approach to cycling and promoting cycling. So what they're seeing is that there is a premium now placed on the availability of homes with car parking spaces. So the demand has increased. Now, we're not in the business of creating more parking spaces here. That isn't what we're talking about. We're not creating more land, and we're not placing a premium on that. We've heard that some people may choose to pave over their front garden and shift away from on road to off street. But what we're seeking to do is nudge. And I don't believe the assertion that this will lead to adverse behaviour and people hanging on to their car. I think it will at the margins change behaviour. It may require some time, it may require some shifts in the pricing over time, but I think it will have the desired outcome.
Okay.
Mr. Lee. I'm trying to pose this as a question. Listening into the discussions, I think there seems to be two perspectives here. In terms of methodology, you're advocating an approach which actually, this notion of nudging, that you're actually projecting a certain possibility as an outcome, and we don't know what you projected, and you're nudging people along, because I think we generally all are committed to an improvement in equality. I don't think nobody around this table or in this room actually argues with that. The other perspective is actually one which says we need to show the evidence that you're actually setting out to take us to move in a certain direction, and the evidence is important in order to demonstrate that. What it seems to me is that both positions could be actually quite tenable. It's just that you've actually chosen to take one position, and the argument on this side is the opposite. But the discussion is more to do with whether we are committed to moving forward in terms of improving equality. And I don't think there's any disagreement on either side on that particular. We may have a difference in how we're going to get there, right? And this seems to be the discussion that's taking place, and I don't think there's any point in pursuing that, because both approaches are quite valid. I mean, it's not a question, I suppose, unless you want to respond to what I'm saying in terms of your perspective, in order to support it. But I think you've already made that case.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'd like to just build on the evidence argument that the Council just made. Within the documents, it states charges are being considered at set levels which will challenge driver behaviour and choices with the aim of reducing car use ownership. So where is the evidence based for setting the fees? Because the sole argument within the papers is basically around the supply and demand argument, but there is no evidence what was used to determine the new prices.
So there's four elements in there in terms of the factors that have been used to determine the differential between the ratings. In terms of the actual range, what we've looked at is inflation over time, and then what would nudge behaviour? What would be a reasonable additional element in order to nudge behaviour? And it's no more scientific than that. So there is no empirical evidence, there are no exemplars out there in order to assist us with this. There's no scientific research that says at this price point you'll get this effect on car ownership. So what we're doing is testing the boundaries of that.
Or guessing.
We're seeking to innovate.
I think we've reached a stage now where we need to go on to consider whether a reference back here is justified and to argue either for or against that. We're focusing on respect for human rights and equality as one of the aspects of decision taking that it maybe felt has not been served properly. The other one, clarity of aims and desired outcomes, whether that extends to providing empirical evidence before you take a decision, I don't know. I think Mr. Lee's been very frank in saying that we don't know in advance what level of reduction in car ownership this might bring about. But let's hear what you now have to say. Go on.
June 6th, is it?
I'm asking for John.
Yeah, I think there may not be a level in reduction of car ownership, but I think people will have less car journeys, and that will have the same effect on air pollution than people just giving up their cars and don't use it at all. For instance, I'll give you an example. When controlled parking was introduced, in my area. I live pretty close to a school, to a nursery school. And the mothers used to come every morning to drop off the kids. And they don't now. One or two, they have the pushchair or the pram instead of using the cars. One weekend we counted up 15 vans stretching all along the road before there was controlled parking. And now there's only 2. There's only 2 for the last 6 months. So people change their way of doing things. They have less car drivers and they give up some of the legal parking elsewhere. So really, giving up the car, selling the car, not using the car, I don't think that will happen. But frequency car journeys will be reduced and that will have enough effect on air quality and say giving up the car.
Thank you. Sally.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to say what changed my behaviour to driving, and I think as a nation, very many of us have been in love with the car and finding it easy to drive around. And to do my job, I couldn't do it without a car, but even now sometimes I do use a bus if it's possible. But what the biggest change on my behaviour as a driver to encourage me to drive less was partly my views, and I joined what was a sort of virtual group of drive 5 miles less a week, which I did quite easily, and I built on that. But the biggest preventer of me driving so much was when, and I cannot tell you the date, it might have been about 10 years ago, they introduced parking in Wimbledon to 11 o'clock at night, whereas it used to be 6:30. And groups of friends, we used to meet up in different areas, restaurants or bars in Wimbledon, and just for a drink and a chat or just a meal. But when the parking came out, we were saying, oh, this increased cost. And one of the men we used to drink with, the work colleagues, an Oyster card. And I have to be grateful for the Oyster card when it came out. We all, as a group, there were quite a large group that varied, bought our Oyster cards, stopped driving, and the prime cause of that was the increased parking charges, the increased controlled parking zones where residents had it because they wanted to park, they didn't want people like me parking. So I do think that it certainly had an impact on my approach and my particular group, the Friends approach, and the increase of charges. Well, I embed it in my principles of life to drive less. Parking and the cost, and I think now, how much does it cost to park there? It's cheaper on the bus or the tube. And I do think it does have an impact on people where it hits their pockets. And I know that from personal experience and friends' experience.
Thank you, sir.
Going on the back what Sally said there, just touching on this evidence thing. Look, I do think evidence is a bit of a red herring, just because I think it's almost totally, well, it is totally implausible that people's use of cars is not responsive to costs. Yeah, I think it's implausible that ownership of cars is unresponsive to cost. The idea that the cost of your car is not the impact on your desire to own one, what you use one, is just not, is a nonsense. I think I get where Councillor McLean was going from about the setting of the correct level, right? When you don't have the evidence base, setting of the correct level is difficult to do to have the nudge behaviour you want. But if you are innovating, I understand that you do that as a observe, orientate, decide, act, observe, constant cycle. The idea of innovation, I noticed sort of was met with sniggers, actually, and I find that extraordinary, because given the proportionality issue, with regards to air quality and environmental issues, I find it absolutely extraordinary that people are laughing at the idea of innovating to try and deal with these things.
Freedom is called, freedom to laugh.
I just find it cute. And I also find it really sort of odd that we're not focusing, that we're getting distracted by this evidence issue, where the actual core of it seems to be what, in fairness, what Councillor Fairclough brought up, which is, has this been done properly with regards to our disabled groups, our age groups, and with regards to equalities. And I see that is the absolute nut of anything that's going to be called back. Is going to be, if it's going to be referred back, it's going to be on the basis of that. And it's on the basis of that, Chair, that I think we really need to understand whether or not the lack of, and I think we categorically know that the process wasn't followed as according to the flowchart. And I don't think there's any debate about that. It's whether or not that in itself undermines the statutory principle of human rights and equality and fair consultation.
It does.
And I think that's the nub of the issue. If that's not done, there seems to be right to refer it back. If that doesn't undermine it, well, it's a moot point. And that's something I'm totally undecided on, because I don't understand whether or not that does undermine it sufficiently to refer this back. So that's where I stand.
We follow that line of to remind you, respect for human rights and equalities. Do we feel that, given the detail we've gone into there, that has been...
But also interlinked with consultation, because that's the second principle.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Just to be clear, I think we've made the point already on equalities, and just to be absolutely in the process, and we don't think sufficient due regard was given to these very important groups in our community. So we're very supportive of a reference back, just to make sure that these very important groups within our community, such as Merton Seniors and Women with Guilt and so on, actually have received and do understand it, and have an opportunity to say to us verbally, yes, they understand it, but they have no comments, or maybe they do have some comments. So we feel that we're very supportive of a reference back, because we think the process perhaps wasn't as full and complete as it could have been.
Following on from Councillor Pritchard, clearly stated that the process wasn't followed as was detailed in the flowchart. Therefore, clearly it has been, you'd expect that it has not been substantiated or followed through, and it would make a mockery of having a process and a flowchart if we don't simply follow it. If we ignore it and just take the decision, so okay, we ignored it, but it's all going to be fine. I don't think that's a very strong base for it to be.
So I think we have a proposal that it should be referred back on grounds not punctiliously following our equalities procedures there. But I'd like to hear counter views that is not a sufficient, what's happened in fact is not substantive enough.
My one proposal is referred back, mine was asked for clarification as to whether or not the lack, and I'm absolutely clear that they didn't follow the process, but that in itself is sufficient to undermine the principles of consultation and human rights and equality, and if it is, I agree, it's to be referred back.
I've just been told that this is a member decision. We don't have a lawyer present to help us on that. Sally, you want to comment?
Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask for clarification whether the groups who didn't respond, I thought you said, but I just want to clarify, they were invited to come tonight?
I understand that's the case.
So further steps were taken to include them?
Yes.
Thank you.
I emailed them as part of, as I emailed residents associations, I've also emailed specifically those groups. I had one reply which was from Merton Sill to say they had some concerns about the proposals, but that it wasn't, given their resource situation at the moment, it's not a priority for them at this time. So they were invited, all the groups were invited to either send in a written submission or attendance speak.
Thank you. And Chair, could I just ask one more clarification? Am I right in saying that people who have been issued with a blue badge are able to park in controlled parking zones and parking bays, there are certain ones, free of charge, so that these charges won't impact on people who are what we would consider more vulnerable groups in our society. Could I just have that clarified as well, please?
That's correct. Blue badge holders have free parking in residence space.
On the process point, you can't cure a failure in process by inviting people to this session tonight. There clearly was a failure in process. Everyone's accepted that. And that clearly that's a fundamental point of decision making. If we have a process, a published process, we must live by that. To argue it didn't matter this time because it wasn't relevant misses the point of the process. We don't know whether these issues are, these mitigation processes or mitigation measures will address the issue. That's why you have a process whereby you go back to identified parties to ask them. And their failure to join in at the beginning doesn't stop the process, doesn't negate the process. With regard to evidence, I don't want to lose this point. What I'd like to say to Sally is, you stopped driving to Wimbledon, but did you get rid of your car because of that? Now, it's rather artificial process where we can't talk to each other. And that is, of course, the point. We all know the council could proportionately achieve its aim by having a vast increase in the cost of parking in Wimbledon. The reason the council is not doing that is because it does not want to kill the golden goose. It wants the money, it wants to nudge, it wanted a bit more money out of the system, but it doesn't want to stop people owning cars, because that would, of course, undermine the resource.
Chair, can I speak?
Yes, please.
Just want to clarify a point that Mr. Lee made with respect to equalities officer. Having scrutinized this issue, and so I'm not untoward to it. Is that correct?
That's correct. I spoke to Everett Willis on Monday this week, and she was content with the process and the quality impact assessment and the improvement plan.
Thank you, Chris. I think this is absolutely right, though, because if you're actually challenging anything, you can't be challenging the legality of the process. It was absolutely, unless you're going to question the equalities officer's assessment of this. And that's what he's paid to do. So I would want to think that, he's correct in what he's actually saying. Therefore, there is no real, your argument that, we should take it back, it doesn't seem to stuck with water, because it would have to actually contradict the equalities officer's assessment in order to go beyond where we are at the moment. And I, for one, I'm not going to actually circumvent that. I have no reason to do so.
I'm going to take the attach on that point. What's that? We reset the resolution.
Firstly, on the evidence, it's what stops me from being completely terrified by, being bold and innovative is plastic bags. The plastic bag thing, nobody really understood what was going to happen, whether it was going to work. And I tell you what, it's really worked for me in my house and most people I know, and I treat them like gold now. But the issue of the equalities process, Chris, you said something about how we don't have to, there is no outlined process for all councils, and we've come up with our own procedures, and you said that it doesn't necessarily matter, but if you can satisfy us as to why in this particular case it doesn't matter, that would be helpful. And also, if we keep referring back to our equalities officer, it would have been good for her to be here. Here.
So I hope I didn't say it doesn't matter. What I hope I said was that I've talked to the equalities officer at Willis, who's on leave today and couldn't make it, so she sends her apologies. But she's advised me, and I've seen an email just now confirming this, she's entirely content in terms of the process that we've taken and the outcome that we've achieved. Now, I accept that there is a view that the flowchart hasn't been followed to the letter, but that's in the context of those groups not responding and us identifying the minimal impact in terms of equality's impact on those groups and a proportionate response taken by the officer in terms of seeking to assess the impact and to put forward an improvement plan that's in front of members and has been.
By definition, the equalities officer will be happy with her mitigation because that's what she thinks will achieve the mitigation. The whole point of the process is to check that judgment. I'm not doubting the equalities officer is happy with what she did. What I'm saying is we didn't comply with the process. And there's no doubt about that. We didn't comply with the process. That's not a matter of debate. It's clear we didn't. On that basis, we must refer it back.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like the right to reply to Councillor Curlin's comments, because I think part of what's been presented to us tonight has been cherry-picked, moving away from the whole particular issue of climate change and pollution in our area. And as an asthmatic, I feel very strongly about it. And making the mistake of going in a multi-storey car park today, I became unwell. So part of my reason, maybe it's selfish, to reduce my driving is because of that, because of air pollution. And I think just looking at these particular parking charges is narrowing in and not looking at the whole particular issue. And I think that's quite tragic, and I think it's quite sad that Councillor Kohler wants to get a round of applause by nitpicking, but there you are, that's his right, on me, because I think it's not about, we need to reduce cars. We've got the statistics of how many cars there are, and we have plenty, certainly in certain parts of the borough where there are several in one household. And I think it is the whole issue about air quality, which personally affects me. I have a brother who's often hospitalised. It is important, but I do think, and I do understand, as someone who has to try and chase up people who don't respond, it is very, very time consuming. And I agree, perhaps it wasn't being done as thoroughly as it should have done. If they didn't respond, you get your second email, and then if they don't respond, ring round. But it's very time consuming. And as you know, that sometimes slips through. It's not acceptable, but it does. But I just wanted to respond to Councillor Kohler, because sometimes, you know, you do need a car, but I try, and I am not driving in the most polluted areas of Wimbledon, which are the underground at the town centre, so I'm helping you in that respect.
Peter, just quickly to Sally Kenny, no one's denying the fact that air quality has to be addressed. What we're talking about is whether this is the best mechanism, but most importantly, I think it's disturbing that we can just push aside a process that is published and think, well, okay, we may have followed it, we may not have, but you know what, it should be okay.
I've agreed to you, it's not right.
So can I look to now, Nick, then for a resolution to refer back on that point? Do you want to spell it out?
I'm not
proposing. You're not.
It's a reference back, I think, on, yeah, it's there, but on the basis of the process which was set out has not been followed. Yeah.
Well, exactly that. We are referring it back because the published process of the council has clearly not been followed, and it needs to be followed.
And one comment from Owen, and then we vote on this.
It's a question of clarification from you. If this is referred back on grounds of inadequate equalities consultation, i.e. not following this process, does the remit, because inevitably this will come back again for iteration 5 and 6 and 7, will we be limited to that specific? Because I don't want to open the can of worms, or every can of worms each time, every one of the 6 principles each time, having been through this now in sustainable communities, having been through it. So what I want clarity on is that if we're going to deeper dive into this and send it back and say, look, for whatever reason, this has not been done properly, and I, more than anything, I actually buy into what Councillor Gretton said, which is rare, right, is that, which is that there is a need for active consultation with these groups, rather than passive consultation, sending an email, right? And that, more than anything, and the admission that we've not done this properly, I buy into, but I'm not going to refer it back. If all I'm going to do is refer it back and suddenly we're just reopening the entire can of worms again, because that's a largely counteractive, you know what I mean, a counterproductive process.
Okay. If you refer it back to Cabinet for reconsideration, Cabinet are required to reconsider their decision and decide whether they wish to continue with that decision or to amend the decision in some way. That's what Cabinet are required to do. They're not required to change the decision, but they are required to consider. If after considering the decision, Cabinet decide that they wish to stick to the original decision, there's no further calling. That's the end of the process. If they changed the decision and made an amended decision, I have to look at that. That's never happened.
Sorry, Julia.
But if it was a different decision, we would have to take the monitoring officer's advice on how different that was, and then whether that's then subject to calling.
If, with regards to these half a dozen specific groups, between referring it back this evening and they then go away and perhaps do more proactively what should have been done at officer level before it goes to Cabinet, right? Is that, or do the Cabinet have to look at it again with exactly the same evidence, or can they actually correct the process, for want of a better description, before they make that decision again?
That will be a matter for Cabinet. In making reference back, you could ask them to do that, but it is a matter for Cabinet to then just to take into account what's been said today and to decide whether or not they wish to continue with the proposal or to make some change.
Chair, in which case, are you prepared to put, sorry John, are you prepared to put forward a specific motion which is with regards to referring this back to Cabinet on grounds that they actively consult these groups with regards to the mitigation measures and the step that Councillor Pepper didn't say, and then look at it again, and then call it a day?
Okay, let me say,
I'm just checking to you've got this. John.
when we say refer it back to Cabinet, are we saying that Cabinet should now go and consult these groups? Would it change anything?
So let's just make sure we the reference back is please. The reference back is on this specific point that we actively consult the affected groups, and so we've got a mitigation with regard to possible mitigation measures. So it's just that I think we're agreed we're going to focus on for this reference back. I do want to move us to a vote. Natasha, one point.
Sorry, I thought that actual point was that they didn't follow the process itself, so I would like to see the process completed. I don't necessarily want to tear up what's happened. So it's the completion of the process. That's the point itself. So maybe we need to amend that wording.
I think we're criticising a lack of proactivity, like we emailed, we wrote to people, but we didn't necessarily.
One specific step.
Specifically, we didn't follow the council's process. So if the council has a process, because if we don't do it now, then when there's something else that comes up in the future, we need to be consistent when we're doing these analysis of groups.
So can I now?
Yeah, that's
can we now go to a vote on that it be referred back?
It needs to be proposed and seconded. Sorry to be.
I propose it is referred back specifically on the grounds of incomplete process and consulting with the disability groups.
And I second that.
So can I see all those in favour?
Sorry, just let me.
Sorry.
Age groups.
All groups listed.
Yeah, all groups listed.
Okay.
So in favour? Would appear to be unanimous. Thank you. So it is referred back. Can we take, because everyone will take 3-4 minutes break now before we come on to the second have your attention. Sit down. We have a number of witnesses for this next call-in, so I do want to move on because it will take longer. I'm going to start by inviting it's Councillor Holden, is it not? And you're presenting on your own with this?
I am. Look, two of my colleagues are going to be answering the questions.
Okay. You have 4 minutes, as you know. Sorry, can we have silence, please, for the presenters go?
Okay, dear committee members, the Merton Conservatives have called in this decision by the Labour Cabinet to impose this parking tax. The Cabinet report states that over 3,000 people responded to the consultation on this, and many more residents submitted comments via their respective residents' associations. This Labour Cabinet ignored all of those 3,000 plus residents. In terms of openness of decision making, it is clear that the decision to proceed with this hike in parking fees occurred as far back as last December, if not before then, where the various Cabinet members made it clear they wanted this to happen. To add insult to injury, at the Wimbledon Community Forum back in March, just as the consultation was launched, the Cabinet member told residents that this is a consultation, not a referendum, indicating that they would or could ignore the feedback from everyone there present. Unlike the diesel tax a few years earlier, the Cabinet designed this time to see what the Sustainable Communities Scrutiny Committee had to say about the proposals. Both in January and again in June, the feedback from that committee was ignored by the Cabinet. In essence, the whole consultation was a sham. It was already decided long ago, and in essence is abuse of good governance and decision making. One of the main reasons for calling this in, because the proposals discriminate against the elderly, disabled and parents with very young children. The Council asserts that public transport is excellent and that journeys around the borough or further away to hospitals, let's say, can easily be achieved on buses. I'm not quite sure who you were kidding about that, but large parts of Wimbledon Rains Park, trying to get to St Helier, is very difficult, often require many bus changes and very long journey times. Able-bodied people may manage or tolerate this, but it's not the panacea the council claims. Even short journeys may not be easy. Often elderly might be lugging around various equipment or baggage, as do disabled people and young mothers. Single people don't have to do that, so you're discriminating against those protected groups. It will make the elderly and disabled in particular more isolated, more difficult for their family, carers, friends and visitors to actually attend and visit. It will reduce their freedom to travel around. In fact, we think the use of your P-TAL ratings is a flawed construct, and even using TfL's own data, it is clear that large parts of Wimbledon have the same rating as large parts of Mitcham and Morden. But the council has decided to differentiate the parking fees between the two places. Another reason is the clarity of aims and outcomes. The council asserts that this will reduce air pollution and improve public health, but there's been no clear evidence or definitive science at all to show how taxing certain areas, for instance in Wimbledon, and not others, such as Mitcham, will actually help improve residents of everybody across the borough. In fact, it could be argued that the council is consigning the residents of Mitcham to worse air quality and worse health, as can be demonstrated already at Mitcham Fair Green, where air pollution has got worse since the bus lane was installed across Fair Green. Even the Alliance of British Drivers notes that the desired aims and outcomes are not demonstrated. It suggested the council should have, as a minimum, itemised the income from these schemes, but also exactly line by line how they intend to spend that. Otherwise, this is just a sham and going into a black hole. Also, consideration should have been given to alternative solutions, and this was clearly absent in the Cabinet report. Such things as getting TfL and partners to improve and setting low emission zones, installation of green screens, and more active role in helping people to switch to cleaner vehicles. Chairman, given this and other reasons you've heard from others and about to hear from others this evening, we feel that the decision should be rescinded and that the Labour Cabinet are asked to think again and engage widely and usefully to bring about progressive solutions, not regressive taxes.
Perfect timing, Councillor. Do we have questions for Councillor Holden and his colleagues?
Councillor Dean, has the council ever done any air quality measures or anything to improve quality in your ward that you're aware of?
Well, very interestingly, in my ward, in Dundonald, for example, if you looked at the clean air strategy, the council doesn't have one. There's not a single electric vehicle charging point, not one. If you look at the number of trees that the council themselves proposed to plant in Dundonald ward, not one. I've encouraged and persuaded them to do many, and we've encouraged as residents to do the same, but not one at all. In terms of parking itself, what we've seen is far more residents paving over their beautiful green gardens. And now we have an issue where, today was a perfect example, where if you go to Toynbee Road now, it's absolutely flooded. And it's absolutely flooded because about 90% of the people in that road now have paved over gardens. So there's no evidence that this council has ever considered a single mitigating circumstance when it comes to air pollution. All it's done is just rake in the money as much as it can.
Other questions?
Just to clarify, it's important we don't just go through the consultation and the whole debate again. Which of the principles of decision making are you specifically focusing on?
I think one of the key things is what you quite rightly mentioned there is decision making. Because a decision, logically, when a group of experienced, intelligent people get together, is you understand what the issue is, you define an objective to solve that issue, and you come up with a strategy to achieve that objective. A lot of residents would argue what they've seen today is we want to tax people in areas where they don't vote for us. How can you retrospectively fit in an objective and an issue? And that's why it's flawed. If this was correct, if pollution is elsewhere in the borough, then surely you would mitigate in those areas, because that's the facts here, that the pollution is in other areas, and the facts are they do not connect to the strategy. And the process therefore is flawed because there has been no process.
So which of the 7 principles of decision making is it based on?
The main ones is sort of clear aims and outcomes and evidence. We are saying there's lack of evidence. We've also gone on the sort of presumption of open fairness and that sort of one, where they basically decided this long ago. They even had the audacity to put it in the budget, and now trying to retrofit the whole thing to make it work so they can achieve their budget aims. They keep denying this, but it's a very convenient line in the budget. So basically, they'd already decided, and the whole thing's been a bit of a fig leaf ever since. So the presumption of open and fairness, due consultation, consideration of alternatives, hasn't anything. All they've been trying for the last 9 to 10 months is this single-minded attempt to hike up parking fees in predominantly one half of the borough. They haven't really given any thought to other measures, and they've not even suggested how this would even work anyway. So it's a lack of evidence, lack of clear aims, lack of clear outcomes, and also with respect for human rights, we've already outlined some groups that have been hit, as was mentioned in the first part of the meeting. So I think we're aligned on that. So there's almost all points we can hit on.
I think I'd advise against pursuing presumption in favour of openness, because that really refers to the taking decisions in public. Okay, so it's decisions taken by cabinet in public meetings. It's 2 rounds of scrutiny. It's this calling.
Well, what I'm alluding to is is that this was made clear by cabinet members when they spoke about this, that they'd already in effect decided long ago, and that's not open. That is them deciding something, then going through the fig leaf approach of trying to cover.
I think you've got plenty else to go on, actually.
Well, I made sure we ticked all the boxes on the calling for.
Chair, if I may add to that, it was quite clear, obviously, in the lines in the budget that these parking charges increases were included. Indeed, you voted for that budget. So I think what Councillor Holden is alluding to is that there was a presumption this was going to go through before the consultation by the very fact that it was in the budget papers in March.
Yes,
as well.
Okay.
Yeah, one quick question, Chair. If I could ask you, do you think it's fair and reasonable if the council and its cabinet members are imposing these very significant parking, CPZ increases across Wimbledon and parts of our borough? Do you think it's reasonable that the cabinet members and the councillors within the administration should be paying them themselves, or how do you see that? Is it proportionate in terms of which councillors may be paying these charges themselves or which may not?
I think it's one of the interesting things. We've seen a number of strategies over the last couple of years where it comes to increasing costs with permits, which exclude people in this room, which exclude people in this building, as if the people in this building's pollution does not affect the lungs of people that are dying younger. So the fact is, this is a discrimination in terms of very specific people. And if at the beginning they'd said, look, we don't like you, and we don't like where you live, and we don't like how you vote, and we're going to charge you to do so, then actually we wouldn't be allowed to be here today, because the legal officers wouldn't allow it, because it'd be the truth. And what we haven't got is the truth.
I'm going to answer further questions. We now have a number of witnesses who want to speak. What I propose to do here is to invite them to come forward in groups of 3. If we could first have Chris Larkman, Lynn Gordon, and Helen Clark-Bell. Have 3 minutes. You're happy if I take you in that order, starting with Chris?
Basically, I need to start. I think we agreed on this, that we're not talking politically at all here. We're not coming behind any political party. I just want to make that clear. Basically, I mean, let's all be clear that a £60 increase in CP charges will have no difference on car usage. Let's be reasonable. There's no logic in that. They reckon it costs about £5 to run a car, including ownership, per annum. So what, 60 quid is nothing. You will not reduce. It just there's no logic in that. But my main point is this, that yes, I'm happy as a car driver to be taxed, and increasingly taxed for the use of my car. yes, we've got to change the way in which we live to be environmentally friendly, and we've got to improve the air quality, no question. No worries about that at all. But this particular charge is fundamentally unfair. People who've got their own driveways don't pay. People in non-CPZ areas don't pay. So it's totally unfair that we're chosen out, if you like, to pay this additional charge. Now, when you set up the CPZs in our area, you had a very fair consultation program, and consultation is one of the questions we're looking at. And we were told at the time that the CPZ charge was for the council to run the CPZ. That's what it was about. We were never told at all that there was any thought of using it later on as a tax. And we just feel you've never really consulted us fundamentally about that change in the charging. So my basic thing is that it is unfair on the way we've been clobbered, or you're suggesting to clobber us with this additional tax. And also, in my last few moments, I just want to say that I'm also representing the Rains Park Association. I've so far been talking on behalf of the Apostles Residents Association, you know, the small streets where we all park in the streets, terraced houses. But I'm also secretary of the Rains Park Association, and we all know that shopping areas and town centres are struggling like blazes, and the last thing we need is the doubling of parking charges. Now, Room Remedies, a lovely shop in Rains Park one-way system, run by Karen Worth, fabulous shop. Now, people will go out to Next. Why? Because they can park there for nothing.
Chris,
now, it's totally unfair. I'm out of time, but I've said all I need to say. So I hope you will listen carefully to those points I've made. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. No one can argue against the need to improve.
Can you just check your mic is on?
No one can argue against the need to improve air quality, but any measures taken must be effective and also not politically biased. So we don't want to discriminate against any disadvantaged groups, and we also don't want to further damage Merton's very aged and struggling commercial centres. So, from a resident's point of view, the proposals to increase the CPZ parking charges are both discriminatory and deceitful. Chris has already explained the basis on which they were introduced and the basis that they should just be covering their costs. We understand that the current CPZs raise about 3 times more revenue at the moment than required to do the job that they're designed to do. 75% of these CPZs are within Wimbledon and Rains Park. And again, interestingly, these are the areas that elect councillors who are not part of the Labour Party. So, going back to the point as well, it's only residents who do not have off-street parking within the CPZs, which only cover about half of the borough anyway, less than half of the borough. So it's a very small number of people. So if you haven't got off-street parking, you only have a residence parking permit if you don't have off-street parking. So those who are parking off-street will not have to pay this. So it's a very, very small number of people who are actually increasing this parking charge and trying to nudge. So it's almost not worth doing. And you're also, again, pushing those residents as well to pave over their front gardens and cause even more damage to the environment. Most residents' cars are parked in the street most of the time, if not they're out of the area. So they are very minor polluters. The big causes of air pollution are the airplanes going overhead, the TfL buses, and so we want to know really what the council is prepared to do about this, because these are the major emissions. What's the council doing about reducing bus emissions? Putney have applied themselves to do this, or what are you doing? And what about the HGVs? The Capac site in Weir Road is a huge local polluter. Lorries thundered through Wimbledon really about every few minutes. And is the council going to fight the appeal to allow them to continue to do so? And where is the loud objection from Merton Council to the latest Heathrow expansion consultation? Because it was very lukewarm for the first one. So, increasing parking charges in Wimbledon and Rains Park will do little, if anything, to improve air quality there. And it will do absolutely nothing whatsoever for Morden and Mitcham. If you are really serious about this, you need to put CPZ throughout the whole borough and make sure that everybody is paying these charges.
With that controversial proposal.
Sorry?
With that controversial.
No, can I just finish?
No, you can't.
All right.
I'd
just like to say they're misconceived, discriminatory and divisive. Thank you very much.
Okay, if you could turn your mic on, I'd invite Helen to speak.
Thank you very much. This is my third opportunity to speak on this issue, having previously spoken at the two scrutiny meetings. And I'd just like to reiterate with my friends here, sorry if I've met you, but that I attended the meeting of the first Air Quality Planning Group this afternoon, and it was decided that air quality is not a political issue, and it really should not be a political issue. And I'm hearing a lot of politics here tonight. And it's regrettable that all party support cannot be sought and cannot be reached on these agenda items. It was also proposed that a survey be undertaken to understand why people are using their cars and therefore identify what the triggers could be for change. I'm hoping that councillors have had a chance to read my submission, so I don't intend to reiterate a lot of those points, but I do think that it is important to understand that given issues of air quality in Wimbledon are not primarily related to parking or those residence parking permits that are issued. It is about through traffic, it is about HGVs, it is about public transport. So where is the evidence that this policy will actually have a positive impact on air quality in Wimbledon Town Centre? We've heard a lot about nudge theory. Yeah, we can all read a book on nudge theory. However, what are the unintended consequences of that nudge theory? 100% increase on a Broadway car park is not a nudge. That will have unintended consequences on independent businesses that we are struggling to keep in Wimbledon Town Centre. We need to all use all levers, I keep hearing that, but the desired outcomes of using those levers are not absolutely clear, they are not stated. We cannot afford to experiment with the health and vibrancy of our town centres and high streets. We've heard a lot again tonight about experimenting and that we don't know what the consequences are, we don't know what the outcomes are, we can't measure the targets. Let's look at what the impact could be on a negative impact on the economics of this borough. There is also no benefit at all to convert to becoming an electric vehicle if you're going to be parking in Wimbledon Town Centre. You will be penalised just as much as anybody else. So I didn't prepare any more than that. I just want to really encourage the council to step back from your politics, step back and look at the environmental impact and the economic impact that this policy could have.
Just stay there. Let me see if members have questions for our three witnesses.
Just a quick question for Helen from Love Wimbledon. There's a very important point which Love Wimbledon raised, particularly regarding the taxis and the hackney carriages which queue outside Wimbledon Station and keep their engines on, they're polluting. And the other big point I think Helen very helpfully raises is the one about the low emission bus zone, which was extremely successful in Putney Wandsworth, of course, which I think by a factor of 70 or 80% reduced NO2 emissions pretty much overnight when it came in. So my question for Helen is, have you got sufficient clarity from the council as what the council is doing to demand from TfL a low emission bus zone through Wimbledon, through Merton, and to take proper action to immediately stop that those hackney carriages which sit outside the train station, keep their engines on? Have you got sufficient clarity? Need to do more from that perspective.
Please.
I think the obvious answer is no. We as Love Wimbledon, on behalf of the business community, also lobby very hard to TfL to get them to change the buses within the town centre and on those routes. I think it's also fair to say that when the ULEZ is increased and expanded within the next couple of years, we're likely to get even more dirty buses coming into Wimbledon town centre because they will be pushed out. That fleet will be used in the areas that are outside of that ULEZ. So watch this space on that one. It can only get worse.
Unless there are further questions, I think I will invite our next three witnesses to come forward. Thank you. So, you have Bill Pett, Econ, and Alison Carr. Bill, you're going to... I kind of feel it would be ladies first, really, but I'll take them in the order in which they come to me. So, Bill, you
yes, sure. I'm the chairman of the South Ridgeway Residents Association with 420 members, and I'd like to object on their behalf to the council's proposed rise in parking charges. A good number of our members are elderly, infirm, and live alone. They do not have drives or garages. They rely to a huge extent on visitors who can park near their homes for a reasonable charge. This proposed rise in fees will cause more isolation for the aged and vulnerable. Also, many of our older members are not blue badge holders but rely on their car for everyday transport. Our high streets are dying. This is not to be helped by a rise in meter charges. I was in Sheen recently. The high street there is hardly attractive. In fact, it's the South Circular Road. Yet it is full of independent retailers and the usual high street shops. They all appear to be doing business. What is the difference? Parking charges in the side streets are minimal. If our high streets continue to die, there will be a resultant rise in online shopping. We will be overrun by even more white vans, hardly beneficial on the polluting front. Which brings me on to what is driving this whole scheme. It is patently, obviously, a tax grab hidden under a green umbrella. I suspect we are supposed to feel grateful to the councillor exercising their duty of care over the purity of our air. There is, however, a very unpleasant smell of political bias and variations in parking charges between different geographical areas are divisive, indeed undemocratic, especially when based on some very flimsy sophistries. Permit charging is traditionally a fixed fee, not a geographical variable. One of the council's justifications for the variance in charges is PTAL rating. Large parts of Mitcham have the same PTAL rating as parts of the South Ridgeway area. Neither has particularly easy access to trains, yet strangely these parts of Mitcham are not subjected to the same price rises as the South Ridgeway area. I would ask the Commission to ask the Council to think again.
Would you like to speak next?
Thank you. I'm speaking as a Morden resident and I'm not affiliated with any political party. I'm going to amend my comments on the fly because I don't want to repeat what other people have said. It seems that the council are trying to achieve different things. They're trying to improve air quality, reduce car journeys, reduce cruising in town centres, reduce parking on streets in town centres and reduce car ownership. And I fully agree with Councillor Kenny that the move to try and push people into car parks, polluted car parks, they then have to walk through, especially those with health issues, is a very bad idea. The Council's own report on public health, air quality and sustainable transport, as others have said, parking and permit holders' charges are a very small percentage, and I've heard people say, if I'm going to be charged more for my residence permit, I will use my car more rather than pay for public transport. This is not what the Council is trying to achieve. In its report to Cabinet in July 15th this year, I fear the Council has misinterpreted the Canadian Parking Association's paper, which does say things like, people will drive somewhere else due to parking charge increases, they will park for a shorter period of time, or they will come to that location less frequently. But it doesn't mean they won't use their car less. And I think the Council has also confused parking charges with congestion charges. There are lots of mixed messages in this report. Increasing car park charges during the day but keeping them low in the evening to preserve the nighttime economy does not send out the message that car ownership and usage should be reduced. Proposals take no account of diesel vehicles that are able to travel for free in the new central London ULEZ. Surely it's better to use a new diesel vehicle with low emissions than an older petrol vehicle with high emissions. Indeed, someone needs to make a proper comparison of diesel versus petrol contribution to global carbon dioxide. Tailpipe emission figures do not tell the full story. Petrol cars, even with catalytic converters, produce more carbon dioxide than diesel cars, particularly as their carbon monoxide emissions get oxidized to carbon dioxide. And we all know carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas contributing to global warming. In terms of the east of the borough, increasing parking charges in the west of the borough will do nothing to improve the air quality in areas such as Mitcham Town Centre, and this is sending the message to people living in the east. They are treated worse than the people living in the west, something I hear again and again from those living in the east of the borough. CPD said permit charges should be increased equally across all parts of the borough, and future increases should also be equal. The proposed increase in residents' parking permits is unlikely to influence car ownership for those not in a CPZ or with off-street parking. The council needs to seriously ramp up its anti-idling campaign. Shoppers and other high street users should be encouraged to come to Wimbledon and our other town centres by making it an event. For example, street performers could be brought in on Sundays for a few hours, especially in the run-up to Christmas. And finally, I trust the council will not be providing free parking in the run-up to Christmas this year or in any future years, something I raised with Cabinet last year. Thank you.
And Alison Carr.
Thank you for the Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Alison Carr and I'm a resident of Merton. At the time of the introduction of residence parking in my area, I lived in Denmark Road and I now live in Thornton Road. I recall some years ago being asked to vote on whether or not I agreed to the introduction of a residence parking zone. And I very specifically remember the letter from Merton Council stating that monies raised from any such parking scheme would only be used to cover the costs of the administration of the scheme. The vote of all residents was informed by that unambiguous statement, and subsequently the scheme was introduced. We are now told that additional monies will be raised from the scheme in an apparent effort to improve air quality. I understand legal advice has been taken by the council. It may or may not be possible to operate a scheme which raises incremental revenue. However, my point is that the mandate for this scheme was specifically obtained on the basis that incremental revenue would not be raised. At the time of the vote, residents believed the council when they made that specific statement, and it is entirely unreasonable to have expected individual residents to have researched the details of traffic legislation to uncover any future changes the council might be able to make. Additionally, I do not believe this Labour Council was elected on a manifesto proposing this change. Consequently, I believe the appropriate course of action is for the council to withdraw these incremental charges. At a minimum, individual residents should be able to vote on whether they agree to increase charges within their particular zones. Proceeding as the council is currently suggesting is a major breach of trust. It is anti-democratic and potentially illegal.
Again, thanks. Do we have questions for our witnesses? I think they've been so very clear, actually. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, opportunity now for officers and cabinet ministers to respond.
Thank you, Chair. So going right back to the start and the introduction to the call, and just picking up on some specific points raised there. Firstly, just is that better? Yeah. So firstly, just to go back to the genesis of this approach that's now been in train for being considered for probably about 7 or 8 months now. This was set out clearly in the Air Quality Action Plan. Recommendation, I think 32, in that Air Quality Action Plan states very clearly, and that was agreed at Cabinet, that the Council will consider parking charges as a means of improving air quality. So we're very clear in setting that out and didn't hide behind it, because what we seek to do, and the law allows this, is to use parking charges as a means to progress other policy objectives. And that goes to the heart of some of the comments I've heard this evening, that the original intention, as stated by some, is that the CPZs were established on the basis of recovering costs to cover the administration. The consultation that we've just gone through, very lengthy consultation, setting out the whole basis of our approach to improving air quality and public health, states that we're seeking to shift that and to use this as a lever to drive other policy objectives, and that's very clear. So there is a shift, and we are consulting, and we are seeking views, and we've heard those views. So this, I would argue, isn't undemocratic on the basis that we have sought to get those opinions. The second point, just around, in the order that I heard them, around the budget, and just to seek to clarify this, it was prudent of the Director of Finance to make provision in the Council's budget estimates for income that may arise. Now that will almost certainly be precisely wrong in terms of the level of income and the timing, but it's absolutely right in terms of proper accounting practice that the Council should at least note that and adjust it along the way, as and when, and I'm sure it will be when it does change, but as and when that figure changes. Coming back to some of the more substantive points, in terms of, there's an assertion that air quality is poorer in the east and better in the west. I'd refer members to tables on page 207 to page 212, which set out very clearly over a number of years the NO2 levels at a number of points across the borough. And that sets very clearly the position that air quality is poor everywhere. And indeed, 2 out of the top 3 locations where air quality is poor, where it exceeds the limit set in law, are areas with an SW19, 3 of them are an SW19 postcode, but 2 of them are very clearly in the west of the borough, the other being at Collier's Wood. So it is not the case that air quality is poorer in the east than it is in the west. Air quality is poor right across the borough, right across London, and that's why legal action has been taken, and that's why the duty has been placed on local authorities to do something about it. And that's what we're seeking to do. And we're seeking to do it in a proportionate way, which recognises the availability of public transport varies across the borough. And we've used PTAL as the basis for that, because it's a sound, adopted measure of public transport accessibility. It's not without its flaws, and there are boundaries where you slip from one PTAL rating to another. And you can argue at those boundaries that the rate should change. But we have used it as part of the development of a charging mechanism which has a basis in logic and the fact that in the east of the borough, public transport accessibility, I don't think anyone would argue, or I hope no one would argue, is poorer. And in the west it is better. So the opportunity to get on a bus, train, tram, tube is there in the west, far more than it is in the east. So nudging people to do something different in the east without the availability of that public transport doesn't feel right. And that's why there is that differential. It's not discrimination, it's recognising the realities. And until we get that transport improved, that will be the case. So we've sought to recognise that in the basis of the charging mechanism. And we work tirelessly with TfL and others. I met with the head of transport planning for TfL just 2 weeks ago to press again our case for cleaner buses in the borough. And I know that the leader, and I think the letter is included in the pack, has written to TfL recently to press that case again. And through the South London Partnership, it is one of our top transport priorities that we assert with TfL on a regular basis. They've said that they will provide that those cleaner buses by 2037. We've said that's not early enough. We have said very clearly that's too long. But we have no control over TfL. Similarly, we have no control over the flight path of Heathrow's planes, and we have limited control over HGVs travelling through the borough. What we do have are some levers to affect driver behaviour, and we're seeking to use those. And we are complementing that with other measures to improve public transport, to improve active transport opportunities in the borough, to tackle engine idling at various locations, and to deal with, in response through, Jason Andrews is here, and he's heavily involved in the response to Heathrow's consultation to seek to assert our position around air and noise pollution and the consequences of that. So we are working on those other matters in parallel with seeking to use what limited powers we have to reduce the impact of the motor vehicle. You're right that there is a large amount of this air pollution created by through traffic, and I think the assertion is that that's about 60% in town centres, but that leaves 40% that isn't through traffic, and that's a sizable proportion that we're seeking to deal with. And you're right, we can't deal with those residents who aren't in a CPZ, and I heard an assertion that this is discriminatory because we're increasing the charges for those residents who are in a CPZ. Those residents in a CPZ could say they're already discriminated against because they pay a charge now, could they not? But they chose to make that charge, and we're consulting them on an increased charge, which is proportionate and we believe reasonable, given the policy objectives that we're seeking to deliver. And lastly, just on the impact on town centres, I hear very clearly Helen's points, and I'm not without doubt that this will, at the margins, I hope, not significantly, but it will have an impact in terms of motorists driving into town centres. But the impact on town centres, the impact on retail, the impact on the whole future of the high street is not solely about the motor vehicle, it's about a range of other more complex matters and changing society and the internet and so on. What we're seeing is other local authorities having to look at the impact of air quality in town centres and elsewhere. And even where we seek to ameliorate the impact, we're at danger of contradicting our own policy objectives. So, for example, where we've put forward a proposal to reduce prices in the evening, there's criticism that actually that's having an adverse impact. So we can't do right for doing wrong in some cases, and what we're seeking to do is balance the competing interests of the retailer, the shop owner, the business town centre, alongside the broader air quality matters. And that's a complex relationship, which I'm almost certain we haven't got absolutely right, but I think the direction of travel is correct. I'll leave it there, Chair, and happy to answer any questions.
Can I first invite questions just for clarification to Chris Lee? In that case, I think we can turn on to discussion, and let's bear in mind we have to consider those principles of decision making and whether any of them have been violated by the evidence we've heard.
I'm going to refer to the parking charges cabinet papers, okay, and this is around clear aims and desired outcomes. 2.7, at the heart of the strategy is making the healthy choice the easy choice. 2.8, the new charging policy aim to deliver reduced car ownership and usage across the borough, encourage more people to undertake alternative forms of active travel. However, cycle routes are a big part of that programme. If you go to the council's own website for Merton cycle routes, at the moment, if you go onto that website, it says, sorry, can't find that page. In the recently published Local Implementation Plan 3, the council's plan for active travel corridors currently consists of arrows drawn on a map, page 19. 3.23 tells us that only 6 kilometres of cycle route have been delivered across the borough in 6 years. And 3.31 tells us that the administration feels, this Labour administration feels, that town centres are areas of poor road safety for walking and cycling, hardly encouraging to residents considering cycling to work. So I simply don't see how, if the clear aim is to promote alternative forms of active travel, when the infrastructure is not there. There is no plan for cycle routes. There's no plan to deliver safe environments for people to cycle to work. So the clear aim is for active forms of travel. The desired outcome, they haven't even thought about it. I would also now move on, but that carries on to the nudge theory as well, which is prominent right through the reasoning of all this policy. The rationale for setting a new parking charge is about giving people the right nudge and opportunities to make choices. But the infrastructure and the ability for them to make those choices to get to that desired outcome are not in place.
Okay, thank you. Natasha.
So, just a couple of questions. Firstly, what did we ever make a bid? Did we not, about the Little Amsterdam funding? And we were unsuccessful. Little Holland, sorry, and we were unsuccessful in that bid. And so it'd be interesting to understand why and what else we're looking to do to bolster cycling. But also on what we're about to discuss, unlike our previous calling, I'm a bit unclear about what it is I'm being asked to look at, because there seems to be a lot of stuff, but nothing very specific. With the previous one, there was a very specific thing that I could say, okay, yeah, absolutely, there was a process here. Just saying that you don't like it isn't really helpful.
I didn't actually say I didn't like it. What I said, and one of the aims that was put down the call-in is clear aims and desired outcomes. If one of the clear aims of the Commissioner's own papers is to promote alternative forms of active travel, surely the administration should have put the forward planning in place to ensure that residents are able to make that choice and reach that desired outcome. That has not been done. Clearly, there is not enough cycle routes. They're saying that they consider that it's unsafe to ride to work through the town centres. So if the clear aim is this, then it's not an outcome. What I'm saying is you're about to introduce a policy, but you haven't got the infrastructure in place to deliver the desired outcome.
Let me come to... No?
But again, if we are to take it, I mean, as somebody who lives in Mitcham, in a CPZ, who can say that the charges are going up there, by the way, I can say that the transport isn't that great on that side of the borough and is better on the west of the borough. Not that you should be penalised, but I understand, but that is the case. So if we're talking about improving the infrastructure, then it will be, well, then how do we improve the transport in the east of the borough? And until that point, you can't penalise people who live far away from a tube station or a train station for that.
Let's take forward, because I don't see this as going to a resolution. Is it no? I was hoping you might offer a legal view there. Sally.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with what Natasha says, and I do find the pictures being muddied by the various comments people have made. I understand your passion about it, and I do think where I live, I'm very fortunate to have good public transport, but I have to walk or get a bus before I get to the tube or the train. But it's my understanding, and I'm sure I'll be corrected by Mr. Lee or the Cabinet member, but the CPZs were asked for by residents, and I remember someone discussing it, that they're saying, well, we want to park by our house, we don't want other people parking there. So someone like me, driving from Morden to Wimbledon, they didn't want me there taking their parking space. Fine, I accept that. The CPZs came in and I get on a bus. So it was a choice of whoever has a CPZ now or the previous owner-occupier of where they now live. So it's an element of choice. And as with everything goes up. Whether we like it or not, everything goes up. So I think people, someone did say they voted for it, well then you have to accept that responsibility. But things don't always turn out as you want, I know that. But there was also the reference to, you know, the buses and planes being polluted. Do you never use buses or planes? You know, this is our society. But we've still got to work at methods that reduce it. And the heavy, large vehicles, well, do you never have one delivering something to your house? Because I find these big lorries a bane in my road, they crack the pavements. And people have to have things delivered. And one misleading point about Wimbledon High Street having a very limited amount of shops. It's always been historically known. Wimbledon High Street was known as the town centre with the least independent shops in London.
Wrong.
No, I'm sorry, I haven't still got the article. I'm talking a long time ago. And, you know, I feel we're not being given factual information with the evidence. I do go to Wimbledon, I do go to Kingston. But I just feel we're avoiding the issue. It is difficult. I accepted people who didn't want parking outside their houses. I had to deal with it. And it is difficult. Oh, I don't have CPZ where I am. I'm unfortunate, I've got a garage, so you can say I'm lucky, okay. But there are roads near me where they haven't, and they would happily go for that, and I have to accept that. And it's one of the things that has turned me to using public transport. And some of the buses that go through, such as the 93, are very clean buses. You know, they're silent, they switch off when they stop, etc. It is difficult, but we, as a group of residents of Merton, we've got to look at issues that will help the health of our group living in Merton, all the people living in it. And as Natasha said, I'm confused as to what you really want. To me, it just seems that you don't want the increase, which part of me understands, but that is life. So I'm sorry, Chair, I'm not really clear on
Can I start by saying, I will rarely say this, I agree with all of my Conservative colleagues have said on the issues of why they're angry about this charge, but with the last point one on an issue of process, and those who live by the sword must die by it, and therefore I want us to get back to process. I want us to actually look at the principles of decision making and say why, despite how many criticisms, heartfelt or white, which I all agree, let's make sure we focus on the principles of decision making. And on that point, it's a proportionality one I keep going back to. And can I ask Chris what he understands by the proportionality requirement?
I think it's a subjective matter. I think it's looking at all the issues in play and assessing whether the policy decision and the scale of the increase in this case is proportionate to the objective that you're seeking to achieve.
And on that point, so proportionality doesn't mean just it has to be small, it just has to be proportionate, it has to be right to what you want to achieve. And this is where I struggle again, and you might accuse me of going back to the same point, that such a small increase in the cost of ownership will not achieve what you're trying to achieve. And yet you didn't do what you could have done and gone for a large increase because that would stop people actually owning cars and paying this money. What's wrong with that criticism?
I think it's a view. And we've taken a view that we want to start at a level which nudges and then keep it under review and increase the charge subsequently if those circumstances require. I think, as I say, it's proportionate to the challenge that we're facing. It's a minor nudge in the context of other policy drivers like the environment, climate change, and people's altruism that should move towards the desired objective of fewer cars being owned and fewer cars being driven.
We come to Ed.
Yeah.
Can I ask just to keep the chatting there? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. Hopefully I can provide some clarity to this point on decision making. The first point you raised, Chair, which is the first point of this decision has to be proportionality, and what it says very clearly in the whole scrutiny process, the action must be proportionate to the desired outcome. And if you look at Councillor Holden's call, it's the very first box he ticked. So I very much welcome Councillor Kenny's line of questioning, which is all about if you are going to, or thinking of driving your car in the evening to go out somewhere, if you're faced with a hike in the parking charges or a cheap Oyster card or something, is that going to influence your decision? And this comes right to this very point, and it's the first point in the decision-making process. And my question for the Cabinet members, probably I think for the Cabinet member for Transport, is if you are sitting, and also for Councillor Kenny as well, if you'd like to answer it, if you are making this decision, which Councillor Kenny very rightfully refers to, which is you're thinking of getting in your car or having a car to go out for evening, that sort of thing. And let's go back to the stated objectives of the whole process of what this parking charge increase is all about. Number one, improving the health of the population of Merton as a whole, and improving the inequality specifically between the east and the west of the borough, and therefore to use this as a means of improving air quality and health outcomes in Mitcham. That is the stated objective of this. Any decision on proportionality has to be made in that very context. So to take Councillor Kenny's point, that's the fundamental objective. It's in the November 2018 Council papers. It's repeated throughout this document in front of us. So to take Councillor Kenny's point, if you are sitting there in the east of the borough in Mitcham and you're thinking of buying a car or getting in your car to go out in the evening, how on earth is hiking the parking charges 4 miles to the west in Wimbledon, how on earth is that going to influence your decision in any way whatsoever? Is it actually going to have any impact at all in the east of our borough, which is the stated objective? It just doesn't make any sense at all to me, Chair. And I asked the Cabinet members to explain why hiking the parking charges in Wimbledon massively is going to have any impact whatsoever on the air quality and decisions of somebody in Mitcham and the east of our borough.
Yes,
Thank you, Chair.
We're meant to be in discussion with it, but it's worth taking that same point.
I mean, obviously, I think in relation to Councillor Gretton's point, in relation to this nudge behaviour, changing the pattern of behaviour. If you know that fees are going to be higher, parking fees in Wimbledon Town Centre, then you may take the choice to take public transport to Wimbledon and actually cut down on your emissions. This is about nudge behaviour, it's about changing behaviour, and it's encouraging people to take up more sustainable forms of transport. We look at the example of London, for example. A lot of people no longer drive into London because there is a congestion charge every day, and actually swap to public transport. So there is clear demonstrable evidence that people do swap to public transport when fees are higher.
Yes, of course.
Just very briefly, because this is an important point. We have never said this is about bridging the gap. This policy is not about bridging the gap. This policy is about improving air quality across the borough, as the Director drew the attention to. We've not spoken about bridging the gap specifically.
It's a critical objective of the Cabinet decision in November.
Well, no, I
health
think
inequality between east and west is the principal factor in the decision, the objective of the Cabinet.
I'm sorry again, so that's the proportionality thing. Either this is too small or this is a hike. You can't have it both ways. Either this is a massive, massive tax on people, or this is too small to have an effect. If we pick one of those, then we can decide which way we're going. And also, I just wanted to know, back on the thing about maybe looking at alternative, evaluation of alternatives, when we were talking about cycling, what happened with our bid for extra funding? Because we all want to improve cycling, we all want to improve those things, and I would just like to know how we can improve those bids and get the money in to make it better.
So just on specifically on the funding for cycling, we weren't successful in our ambitious bid for Mini Holland funding. Kingston, our neighbouring borough was, and that's why they...
It might have gone on very
That's why Kingston have been able to invest significantly more funds into cycling infrastructure, including the joint scheme that we were able to deliver just recently between New Morden and Rains Park. Another scheme we've delivered through our own funding and through LIP funding is along the Croydon Road around the southern side of Mitcham Common. So we are able to put cycling infrastructure in. The reason most cyclists are nervous about using the roads is because of the presence of too many motorists. So the balance is about putting the infrastructure in, and that doesn't always have to be separated cycling lanes, because we won't be able to re-engineer our roads presently to be able to fit those in right across the borough. It's providing a safe environment, and within the limited resources that we have, we seek to provide that cycling infrastructure through the annual programme. But our ambition is limited through that funding.
Thank you, Chair. Unlike the first round, I'm not clear that we've heard anything new in this round of discussions. Now, I understand what people are saying with proportionality. For me, the idea of proportionality, and oddly, my background suggests comes from sort of how it's used with regards to self-defence, but it's measures and countermeasures are proportional to the threat at hand. Now, it's not about whether or not it's the 60 quid will nudge. Proportionality is about the policy that you are implementing, the measure you are implementing is proportional to the threat that you face. And if we believe that the threat of air quality, as I think certainly a number of the people given evidence to, is a great one, well, we certainly think that a 60 quid rise is proportional to that. Whether or not it's effective is a different issue, but I don't believe that that's specific to this issue of proportionality, and that speaks to the question of innovation versus empirical evidence that I think we touched on previously. So that issue of proportionality, I think it is proportional to the threat that is a measure that is proportional to the threat that is faced. The issue of evidence, is it we've touched on before, and the issue of empirical evidence, whether or not it's enough. We heard good evidence from two different gentlemen sitting in the, the first gentleman to speak said, you know, it's not going to make any impact because the average car ownership is 6,000. Another gentleman said that it would actually preclude people from acting. Those two things aren't mutually incompatible. We understand that, right? Because different people behave in different ways. But there's certainly a chance that it will reduce, and it's up to us, up to the council, to see whether or not it does have any desire, does have any impact. The issue of aims, I don't think the aims, and this is finally because I think Eve spoke passionately about it, a number of people have spoken passionately about it, about this wider environmental point that we're not doing enough, right? So there's two things that come together here. One is to do with aims, and one is to do with due consideration of alternatives, right? Everything that Eve and others have said, including councillors here, right? They're not alternatives. They're complementary measures, right? And, you know, as Paul said, we've got to, you know, when it comes to stuff like this, referring things back, we stick to the due process. Now, none of these things are alternatives to the measure being taken. They're complementary measures, right, to the great threat that is environmental threat and air quality. Do I think we're doing enough? Absolutely not, right? You know, there's very little that Eve said that I disagree with, except for a conclusion, which is that impacts upon this decision, because it doesn't. And the aims, I don't think anyone here is unclear as to what the aim is. They may think, and I go back to this again, that it's not going to impact upon it. That 60 quid is too much, 60 quid is too little, whatever you think, we don't know. But that idea of innovation being prohibitive to policy is wrong, is the wrong place to start. So I haven't heard anything new, and I haven't heard, I'm afraid, anything being said that directly aligns to the referral processes, unlike in the previous one, where there was absolutely clear linkage that there was something new, something hadn't been done, and people were going to be disadvantaged. I get why people are upset about it. I don't have a car and I live in the east of the borough. I used to have a car and I used to live in a CBZ, so I do get it. But I don't think that that impacts upon our ability to refer this back this evening, because none of the points that allow us to refer it back have been adequately argued or directly argued in the way that they were in the first round.
The various presentations have made some very forceful points, but I must conclude that they've undermined their position, because some of the arguments that they've made actually don't stack up. Right? So in total it doesn't stack up because of that.
Are we allowed
I
to say
think
things?
you're Ed, do you want to?
Yeah, I think I understand the point we're making is in some sense, it's not just a process point, it's a bigger one on the whole sense and the substance of it. It's probably a much more difficult one for people representing the elected administration to actually accept. So I understand that. I note, however, that I asked a very specific question. Nobody made any attempt at answering it. Nobody was able to offer anything whatsoever, and there's not any in the papers as to why it's going to help Mitcham. They didn't even know the own stated objectives of the Cabinet. Fundamental objective was to bridge the health inequality and improve air quality in the east of the borough. Very start of this process, and it's repeated throughout. We weren't even familiar with that. So there's a very clear point on substance and also on process. It's not really right to say that the point isn't suitable to raise. I will, however, I'll help a little bit by offering something in relation to PTAL, because I think Councillor Preach is looking for something new. And PTAL is just sort of referred to in this document as almost like a one-liner to say it justifies the whole setup of the parking charge. It doesn't go into any detail, but the reality is about PTAL. It was introduced by Ken Livingstone a very long time ago. It's seen as very out of date. We've heard tonight from the Ridgeway Residents Association how there are parts of Wimbledon Village, for example, that have the same PTAL ratings as parts of Mitcham, but there's a massive, massive differential there. And there are other things with PTAL it doesn't take into account, I don't believe, the tram network. Mitcham, for example, has 3 different transport components, which no one in Wimbledon Park has, and no one in Wimbledon Village has. If you try and get to Wimbledon Village by public transport, it's no easy process. Anybody can tell you that. But if you look at Mitcham, they actually have lots of none of this is actually taken into account in any of the PTAL considerations, which is why it lacks due consideration as a key decision. For example, Mitcham has a national rail network that goes straight to Victoria, straight to the city from Mitcham Eastfields. It has a tram network, none of that's mentioned in here. The whole tram network is missed out from the PTAL considerations altogether. There are more Northern Line connections from Morden, which only has £100,000 of the £5 million revenue from the CPZs. There's connections, of course, on the Northern Line, both to the West End and the city, which Wimbledon doesn't have that in exactly the same way. So there are very significant infrastructure in place in relation to transport in the east of the borough, which don't get more than just a one-line reference here, and it's inadequate. The whole reference to PTAL doesn't take into account how out of date it is, what the flaws are, and how really a proper process to do something as drastic as this by hiking the charges in Wimbledon to help air quality in Mitcham, it doesn't take into account how PTAL has moved on and how the actual infrastructure network between the east and west is different. And that's why it's a document that, as a matter of process as well as substance, is inadequate. It's a flaky decision. I think we all know that. I know that the excellent officers of the council are doing as good a job as they can to try and justify it, but the decision as a whole is flaky, and it's one which I think residents will be looking very carefully at in case they wish to consider some kind of legal challenge to it, because it is so flaky.
I'm just going to ask to confirm that when new transport modes like tramlink come along, then PTALs are adjusted to reflect that?
What?
Just on a factual.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, what I can do, PTAL is the accepted model used by planning officers right across London. and it is sound and reliable, and we've used it as part of the basis for the charging. It's not the sole basis for charging, but it's part of it. It's robust, it has a foundation based upon evidence, it takes account of new transport connectivity, and I suppose I'd ask again, would anyone in this room suggest that the East is better served in transport terms than the West? I don't think anybody would. And so we have used a model which seeks to look at PTAL ratings, and there are 4 levels that we've applied across the borough in building up this model, and not the only elements that we've used in this model, but part of it, in order to provide that degree of reference and referencing the differential and the deficit in transport in large parts of the borough. No more than that, really. It's not the only factor, but it is one factor, and it's based upon sound evidence and used right across London and updated.
Sally, I'm going to ask.
Thank you, Chair. I really appreciate this opportunity. I disagree very, very strongly with what Councillor Gretton has just said. I use public transport quite a lot, and I find it so much easier to get to Wimbledon than to get through anywhere in Mitcham. If I want to go to Mitcham, it's at least 2 buses. I can get a bus immediately to Wimbledon. I have got, from where I am, 3 buses, and I could get off and get on the Northern Line, or I could take a bus further along. I don't think you've ever travelled in Mitcham. Or you could, well, yeah, for going through it. Where'd you get on? Have you ever travelled? Yeah, and I know Mitcham Junction too. I cannot agree with what you just said. I think it is a great inaccuracy, and you are playing to the gallery and misleading them, and I object.
With the residents, I'm going to close that debate down. Nick.
Okay, just for clarification on with Councillor Pritchard. Cabinet Papers, 15th of July, clearly states, doesn't say complementary, it says undertake alternative forms of active travel. So they could have quite easily inserted complementary forms of active travel, it clearly says alternative. So let's
Can you just read that?
Encourage more people to undertake alternative forms of active travel. 2.8 Cabinet Papers, 15th of July.
Yeah, I think if I may, I think it's alternative forms of active travel from cars, whereas what we're talking about here is due consideration of alternative policies, right? So just because something contains the word alternative doesn't mean it applies. It's alternative policies have the same effect, right? What I'm saying is that all the things that he talked about were complementary policies that have the same effect, right? What you're talking, and that effect is alternative travel, absolutely.
But
yet we can't get away from the fact that we are guided by 6 very specific principles, right? Which, and one of them, that one you're touching on, due consideration of alternative policies to have the same effect, right? Which is the effect being reduced air quality, okay? Though everything that has been listed very passionately are complementary policies, but alternative modes of transport.
Okay, on that basis, I'll go back to Chris Larkin, who basically made a very good point. This is just an unfair tax grab under a green umbrella. Because you're putting in all this sort of stuff and trying to say, well, okay, we're going to get you out of your car, but you're not quite providing the opportunity to take the alternative forms of active travel. And I think that just really highlights the position that this really has been used as a green umbrella to hijack. And let's be honest too, why is that poor transport in the East? Why has not more been done to improve? And why now is the West being penalised for inaction on getting better transport in the East?
Okay, I think we've got 2 of the principles in contention here if there is to be a referral back. They are lack of proportionality, that the action is not proportionate to the desired outcome, and the other one is consideration and evaluation of alternatives, a failure to consider and evaluate alternatives. Does anyone wish to propose a motion or referral back on either of those?
Would like to put forward a referral proposal. Proposals offer insufficient modelling or evidence to show how either of the Cabinet's two primary objectives will be met in terms of either improving equality to the borough as a whole or in terms of improving health outcomes in Mitcham and the east of our borough. As such, the Commission advises Cabinet to place the proposals on hold, consider alternative measures and set out a clearer evidence-based proposal that would actually deliver on the Cabinet's stated objectives.
I'd really like you to link those into the 6 principles or can
Yeah,
Well,
it's I think effectively it's the sixth one, which is due consideration of alternatives.
Okay.
And the first one being rather, yeah, the actions
And
are in no way
proportionate.
proportionate
So
to the
you're
stated
playing those
aims.
two.
Of course they're not, we know that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fine. Has been seconded? Yes. Happy to second it. Can we have a vote then, please? Let's put that back on that basis. All in favour? And against?
Ignore your residents.
Yes.
So that's not.
Arrogance. You're not in charge forever.
Thank you all. I think let me just add, get a chance to say something now. There are a number of things that even if we're not making reference to that we would like to add as informative. I would suggest that we do want to see 12 months hence a review of the impact of these charges from when they're introduced. Bearing in mind that the objective is to improve air quality, we will rather see numbers of permits issued or not issued, but it's the air quality figures I think we wanted to relate. We have been promised and would like to see, I think, the results of the diesel levy now some 2 years on, as soon as is practicable. And finally, I note because I jotted it down, our cabinet members' words, that this will be one of a suite of policies, and I think we look forward to that and to seeing other proposals for tackling air quality, because this alone will not be enough. But can I take it those 3 particular informatives are accepted and agreed? Thank you. And thank you all for your attendance and your contributions.